Yeah, so today's reading is Habakkuk 1, verses 1 to 17, which is on page 940 of the Church Bibles. The prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you will not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people, who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy?
Evening. Here we are. Chris has set the scene for us. We've just read there from Habakkuk, the first chapter. This is familiar ground for us. I wonder how many of us have ever called out, "How long, O Lord?" How many of us have questioned why? God, why is there suffering? God, why does it look like you're not doing anything? I know I have, and I know I will do, and Habakkuk does here in this passage. This is familiar ground. There are no quick and easy answers to the question of suffering and chaos in the world around us. The book of Habakkuk is a short book in the Old Testament. This evening we're looking at the first chapter, the first 17, 18 verses. This is the first of 3 sermons looking at this book. It's a book of the Bible that really you've got to take as a whole and not apart. It doesn't really finish at the end of the chapter. It continues. It's one train of thought. This evening we're not going to answer the big questions about suffering once and for all. What we will find is that God speaks in the midst of our suffering. And this passage is structured like a dialogue. It has questions and answers. We have Habakkuk's complaint, God's answer, and Habakkuk's second complaint. And this pattern continues. It's a question and answer between God and Habakkuk throughout the rest of this book. At the very center of our passage this evening, God speaks. As we sit in the center of this passage, God is speaking. If you've studied English literature, recently I'm looking at our young people, they're around somewhere, or some of the students who have just come to Southampton, you'll be used to spotting different types of genres by structural techniques. Does this sound like stuff we've covered before in English? You read something and you know what's coming next by how it starts. Whether that's a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, to dearest reader, or to whom it concerns. We know what's coming next. The tone of what's been written is given to us by the first line, whether it's fantasy, regency, gossip, or a spam letter through the post. And the same is true for the Bible. Verse 2 begins with this phrase, "How long, Lord?" What can we expect from this phrase? This is a Bible phrase with a Bible meaning. And what this tells us is what's coming next is written in the style of lament. Now, what is lament? Habakkuk is writing here in the style of lament. He's lamenting over the suffering him and his people are facing. What is lament? Read this quote with me. "Lament is how you live between the poles of a hard life and the trust in God in sovereignty. Lament is how we bring our sorrow to God. Without lament, we won't know how to process pain." Lamenting is like sitting in the middle. It's dwelling in between two things. It's a prayer in pain that leads to trust. That's what we can expect to find as we read through Habakkuk's words. Habakkuk was a prophet, which meant that he was someone who heard from God and spoke to God. The role of a prophet is to sit in the middle between the people of God and God, to sit in the middle between the questions we have and the God who has answers, to sit in the middle of suffering and the God who is in control. And this evening we are sitting in the middle. We see as we look to the world out there that things are not right. There is suffering on every side. There is war and injustice, murder and deceit. These are scary times to live in. Chris said what he said up the front to me throughout the week, and it hit me. It's like, yeah, these are terrible times. These are scary times. As we read of news stories from over there and over here, it all hits home. We see suffering on every side. We know this by experience, and we know God. So we sit in the middle as well. We sit in the middle between the questions we have and the God who has the answers, the suffering we see, and the God who is in control. That's why it's so important for us to open up this book of the Bible in Habakkuk. We are sitting in the middle of things. Habakkuk was sitting in the middle of things. So with this in mind, let's turn to our first chunk of this passage. This is Habakkuk's first lamenting question. Now, I don't know if it's going to come up in the NIV or the NLT. You might have noticed that. So if you want to follow along in your Bibles, this is page 940. I'm going to try and read it from what is up there. "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted." Notice the questions throughout these verses. How long, Lord, is a question. Why is a question. Why? That question comes up again. Habakkuk is not afraid to question God about the suffering he sees around him. These questions tell us a little bit of the context of what this suffering is. What are the people of Judah facing? As we read through this list here in verses 2 to 4, we see that it gets worse and worse as you go through. It gets more severe and more severe. We have injustice, trouble, destruction, violence, strife and conflict. Things are getting worse, not better. That is what the people of Judah are facing, a sort of suffering that is getting worse and worse with no end in sight. Things are so bad, in fact, that the mechanism that God gave to deal with the wicked people has been paralyzed. That is to say that it cannot move in justice against these people. Verse 4, "Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. The wicked are surrounding those who are righteous. Justice is not taking place, can't take place." Have you ever felt surrounded and powerless to the suffering around you? I do right now. There is something about the extreme power of others that makes you feel extremely powerless. So you ask, what is there for me to do? This is what the followers of Yahweh in Judah were facing. Those who are turned away from God in pursuit of sin and wickedness are causing suffering for God's followers. Suffering surrounds them. They would have felt powerless. And to this, Habakkuk asks in anguish and confusion, how long, God, are you going to stand by and watch us suffer? How long are you going to stand by and not do anything? Because, God, it doesn't look like you're doing anything here. It's a big question. The prophet's understanding of God as just and righteous is not matched by his current experience of God. This is what sitting in the middle looks like. He sees the suffering around him and he knows God, and he's trying to balance these things up. Notice Habakkuk's boldness in calling out this injustice. Habakkuk is unafraid of questioning God. I find this really encouraging. When I'm sitting in the middle of my own big questions, I can bring them to God. God is big enough for my questions. It's not a bad thing to question God. It's not a lack of faith. Remember, Habakkuk was someone who spoke to and heard from God. And yet he is comfortable in asking God these big questions. God is big enough for your questions. And what usually follows a question is an answer. So God answers. That's the next chunk we're jumping to now. God will always answer our questions, but not always in the way we want him to. And that's what Habakkuk finds here in verses 5 to 11. The answer that God gives is not the answer Habakkuk wants. I read this now, verses 5 and 6. Again, it's in your Bibles, page 940. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if it were told you. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. God says this, he says, look and watch. The same phrasing is used in verse 3 as Habakkuk is lamenting. He says, why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? God, why are you looking on these things and not doing anything? And God's response is here in verse 5. Look and watch what I am doing. God is not standing by doing nothing. Look at what he is doing. Verse 5, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if it were told. It starts so well. Habakkuk must have been listening to this. He's like, yes, God, you've seen me, you've heard my complaints, and you're about to bring your salvation. We're going to be saved. It's all going to be over. This is exactly what we want. And then God continues, I am raising up the Babylonians. Not so good. That ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. This is God intervening. This is God's answer to the question. He is doing something. But it's not the salvation that Habakkuk was wanting for. Instead, God's response here is judgment on the wicked people. God's response is to raise up the biggest, meanest army of the day and bring the people of Judah into exile, the wicked and the righteous. God's response is judgment. Sin requires an answer. The penalty of sin is death, and God is not shying away from the consequence of rebellion against him. The wicked in Judah were sinning against God. Their actions could not go unanswered. God is no nonsense when it comes to sin, so God intervenes. Verses 7 through 11 carry a description of what this judgment looks like, what this intervening looks like. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong, their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty people whose own strength is their God. What we take from this, the Babylonians, not good people. You only need to read this description to answer that. And you know, this description is given by God. This is not like one football team telling you that another football team is not very good. It's not that. This is God, who is absolute truth, telling us that the Babylonians are bad people. Look at the power of the description. Swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves, flying like an eagle swooping to devour. This is prey and predator language. Prey and predator language dominates this part of the passage. The Babylonians will come and they will round up the people of Judah like a predator taking on prey, like wind collecting sand, effortless. They will be taken prisoner. And it seems that there is very little the people of Judah can do about it. And then a little bit further on, we see this picture of warfare. The fact that Judah could mount some sort of defense is laughable. Ancient cities at this time were usually built on mounds of earth. Now, the way these mounds of earth came about is when a city was destroyed, they would rebuild the city on the same place. They thought, well, our walls were not high enough last time, so we will build on the ruins of the old city so our walls are even higher. And then this happens again, and it happens again. And you see that cities were built on mounds. They look like this. This is called a tell, is the word. Tell me more, I hear you cry. Well, I will. Because this is what the people of Judah had done. They'd built up these tells and placed their city on top to defend against people like the Babylonians. But the Babylonians were masters of warfare. So what they would do is they would come along and they would build earthen ramps. That's what this passage talks about. They would make earthen ramps so that they could walk straight up to the walls and come into the city. The Babylonians were well known for this. They were masters of it at the time. There is nothing left for the people of God to do. This was God's judgment, and it was going to overcome them. There is no doubt about it. And what happens next for the people of Judah is this leads to a period of exile, where God's people are captured and scattered across the Middle East. Displacing people was the most efficient way of defeating them. You can't come back together and mount any sort of defense if you're scattered so far. Some of us here this evening have been scattered from our homes. We know what this feels like. This suffering is real for you. You are lamenting right now between where God has called you and the families you've left behind. You are sitting in the middle of this suffering. This is real. Habakkuk wants for salvation. God's answer is judgment. Sin requires an answer. And what does God say? He says, look and watch. The penalty of sin is death. God is not shying away from the consequence of rebellion against him. And you know what? He doesn't. Look and watch, God says. Sin requires an answer that we cannot give with anything but our lives. God gives an answer, and the answer is sending Jesus to face the consequence of our sin. The consequence of sin is death. Look and watch. Jesus on the cross, dying for you and me. God judged the wicked on account of their sin. This looks like judgment. This looked like the Babylonians coming along and conquering them. And God judges Jesus on account of our sin. And this looks like for us salvation. It's all wrapped up in the biblical story of grace and judgment. You know, the exile is the last thing that happens in the Bible before we flick the pages and we come to the New Testament, the story of Jesus. God does not stand by and watch. God is doing something. God is doing something with Habakkuk. To Habakkuk's complaint, God gives an answer. It's a confusing answer. It's a difficult answer. But God does not just stand by and watch the suffering. He is at work in their suffering. And God is doing something with Jesus on the cross. To the question of sin, God gave a definitive answer, an answer for all answers. Jesus gladly took up a place in the middle for you and me. Jesus suffered. God came to suffer with his people. And God is doing something in our suffering. God suffers with us and for us. We are not alone. It doesn't make sense. It hurts, but God is in control. It's hard. It's really hard. And honestly, this doesn't sound like much consolation just by saying it's hard. For those on the brink of war who are under threat, displaced and persecuted, there is immense pain. Where can we take this pain and suffering? We can take it to God. Learning to lament looks like expressing our faith in difficult times. It's messy and unrestrained. It's raw and unfiltered. It's real. Reading Habakkuk is a lesson in lamenting. And see how this passage ends. We're jumping to our third chunk here, Habakkuk's second complaint. Verses 12 to 13, Habakkuk says, Lord, you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? We see here that Habakkuk doesn't understand God's response. It doesn't make sense to him. It doesn't make a whole load of sense to us. Even with the wider picture of Jesus on the cross, it's difficult to rationalize God's judgment here. Habakkuk again questions God. Why, God? Why? How is this in your nature to do these things? He laments. He tries to line up what he knows about God and what he's seeing God do, and it leaves more questions than answers. And hear this, I found this quote. It says, to lament is Christian. As we turn to God in prayer, lay out our complaints, ask boldly, and choose to trust. No one else gets to lament like a Christian, because no one else has a God like we do. A God who can both take our complaints and can be fully trusted. And even when it doesn't make sense, even when the answer isn't the answer we want to hear, even when we can't really line everything up, God can be fully trusted. Notice the differences between Habakkuk's first lamenting question and his second lamenting question. The first contains strictly lamenting and complaining and questions. He says, why, God, are you listening? Those are the focuses. Why, God, are you listening to us? Then God answers the first complaint. The second complaint is similar. It has lament and it has questions. Those themes go all the way through this book in Habakkuk, but it also has worship. The profound difference here is Habakkuk's response to God. In the midst of suffering, knowing who God is, sometimes that's the only answer we get. Habakkuk chooses to worship God. Amongst his questioning, he has some profound declarations of who God is. Things that don't make sense. He's saying these things and it doesn't make sense compared to what he's seeing around him, but he calls God Yahweh. This is a recognition that God is active in all of history. God is Yahweh. God is everlasting, he says. God is there from beginning to end. Habakkuk calls God my God. There's a personal aspect there. God is knowable. This is my God. Habakkuk calls God the Holy One. God is set apart in holiness. There is no one like our God. God cannot do anything that is evil. And he recognizes this in the midst of the suffering he is seeing. He calls God the rock. He calls God reliable and steadfast. Habakkuk knows suffering. He's seen it, he's lived it, but he also knows God. And however big the suffering he faces is, God is bigger. However big the suffering may look like, God is bigger. God is Yahweh, everlasting, my God, Holy One, the rock. As he laments, as he sits in the middle between these two things, look at where his focus is. Is his focus on the suffering, or is his focus on God? We're going to jump ahead a little bit to next week. This is Habakkuk 2, verse 1, and this is what it says. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to his complaint. And you would have thought this passage would have concluded with Habakkuk gathering the people of Judah and telling them to sharpen their swords, build the walls higher, maybe even to repent. But that's not how this part of the passage ends. Habakkuk watches and waits. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give this complaint. Habakkuk watches and waits with his eyes fixed where? Not on the suffering he sees or the military might or their preparedness for what is coming, but no, his eyes are fixed on God. God who is Yahweh, everlasting, my God, Holy One, and the rock. Habakkuk is focused on God. I'm going to finish with this quote. It's going to come up on the screen. I'm going to read through it. And this is a quote. This quote is going to help us to kind of bed this in as a way of reflecting on this passage. It says this: I wonder if we sometimes miss God's soothing of our hearts when we rush into whatever we believe will ease the pain, still the turmoil, soften the blow of what we are learning about God, about ourselves, about life, and how it is unfolding for us. I wonder if we sometimes miss how God might want to minister to us because we are too eager to move on, too quick to relieve the ache we feel with the pain relief of activity. And because of that, we sink into despair, into hopelessness, and sooner or later, perhaps, a withdrawal from the very presence of God, the God of all comfort. As we come this evening to a time of communion, this is a sitting in the middle. Communion is a sitting in the middle between the suffering we face and the end of suffering. God who came and the God who will come back. The kingdom come and the kingdom coming. And just as Habakkuk stands and watches, focused on God, we can come to this table and focus on Jesus.